All right, here's a very long comment by Iranian dude on reproduction versus masturbation. He said, since my country has gone through the fastest, he means, fertility drop in human history, I think I'm in a unique position to comment on this particular issue. This is a massive wall of text, by the way. What took 100 years to become normalized in the West is taking decades to be replicated in South America and the Middle East. And if you observe the events chronologically, you will soon see a very interesting pattern emerge from the apparent chaos. These patterns are strikingly similar to those that emerge when one studies the history of the West, but on a much smaller scale. First, there is war. Devastating modern war. In the West, this was called World War I. Here in my country, it was the second longest 20th century war between Iran and the neighboring Iraq. Before such wars, ideals of masculinity reign supreme. Women are in their proper place, and men thirst for an opportunity to prove themselves. They are bound by honor and beholden to the truths of their nation. They are God-fearing, honest, brave, and competent in what they do. But then the war comes along. The advancement of projectile weapons renders all higher values of masculinity null. Bravery can no longer save you, elevate you, or honor you. It can only get you killed. You're just a number a million? You're just one in a million, I think he means. You're just one in a million, quite literally. The swarm of bullets pierces everyone's bodies equally. The coward or the brave are all dead meat. The chemicals burn everyone's lungs, friend or foe. The horror that is modern warfare has a deep, psychologically devastating effect on men as individuals and also as a collective. On some level of consciousness, this creeping realization takes root that we're all going to die. All right, well, let me just stop there. I understand what he is saying, but I think it's a little bit, but I think it has a somewhat rosy view of the past, you know. So war has always been horrible, and I don't know that bravery always had a lot to do with success. If you look at the history of war, the deciding factor in most wars leading up to the 20th century was, superior weaponry, obviously, but also superior discipline, which means that the men will, march in formation, they will do what they are told, they will hold their ranks together, even when they're being obliterated by enemy fire or whatever, right? So like they'll march into gunfire. Okay. Now that approach, marching into gunfire, stopped working once gunfire became more effective, and that was one of the things that happened in World War I. But there was nothing unhorrific about the Civil War in America or any earlier war. Like all this propaganda that makes war into this, noble pursuit. No, it's just people killing each other, burning each other's villages, raping each other's women, killing each other's children. It's always been horrific. Yeah, look at the way that the war was conducted by the Native Americans. To them, war was one group of men going to another village, fighting some other men, possibly, killing all the people they found, old people, children, taking the young girls away as sex slaves. I mean, that's war. And it's always been like that. So there have been differences, but the fundamental nature of war is always going to be horrific. It's not this noble thing. It's not this wonderful thing. And I think what happened was not that, before the war, women were in their proper place or whatever. What has happened during the 20th century is modernity. It's abundance. It's the birth control pill. It's machinery. It's fossil fuels. It's all that stuff. I'm not saying these wars didn't have an effect, and they might have wiped out certain kinds of men more than others and had an effect on the genome in that way, or the culture, or whatever, but I don't think this is the one factor that explains the modern world. I mean, he's putting it very eloquently, right? So I don't want to dismiss what he's saying because he put a lot of effort into writing this, but I just don't think that's the case. I agree with him on some of what he says here, but not on that. Yes, it played a role. Certainly, World War I led to the downfall of the regimes, the existing power structure in the West, outside of the United States, because it discredited itself, right? It showed that it was not able to deal with the challenges of the modern world and that it was not really acting in the interests of the people. And that's why you had the Russian Revolution, but that's also why you had other forms of social upheaval and the reduction in the importance of the aristocracy in the rest of Europe. Because, they failed. The aristocracy failed. But they didn't just fail because there were modern weapons and they didn't understand the modern weapons, although that was part of it. They failed because there was no point to that stupid war. It was just pointless, and they demonstrated that they had no vision, they had no plan, they didn't know what they were doing. They weren't acting for the good of their people, they were just acting like idiots. And so they rightfully were overthrown in many cases, or rendered irrelevant because of their failure. And the democratic countries did better, so that helped to legitimize liberal democracy. Well, anyway, I'm going off on a huge tangent about history, so let me go back to reading this. He said, Western right-wing commentators often fail to find a reason as to why their forefathers would give up on the great deal that they had, and their answers are almost always wrong. If it were the Jews, then why did whites suddenly decide to listen to the Jews? If it was universal suffrage, what events transpired that facilitated the process, at the end of which universal suffrage became a reality? In Iran, since we had a smaller yet accelerated version of those events, it is much easier to discover the true reason behind this great betrayal. Burnt lungs, shattered faces, destroyed limbs, mountains and mountains of young, brave, God-fearing boys coming back in coffins. So men ask themselves, the smarter ones out loud and the practical ones subconsciously, is it really worth it? Well, yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, rightfully, they would criticize the Iranian regime for sending their sons to their death for nothing. Of course. But you can look at the fertility rates in the West, and they were at about 3 point something after World War II, and then after the birth control pill came in, they plummeted below 2 very rapidly. So it was the birth control pill. It wasn't the war. Americans were almost entirely unscathed by those 2 wars, and yet America was like on the leading edge of this cultural change. Anyway, okay, so men ask themselves, the smarter ones out loud and the practical ones subconsciously, is it really worth it? So the intellectuals start deconstructing all those ideals that are causing such destruction, and the general population rewards their efforts with attention and approval. Let's go ask the Jews, since they have successfully coexisted with others. Well, that doesn't make sense. Let's go talk to women, since they managed to solve their conflicts without any bloodshed. Let's abandon those outdated notions that can no longer serve us and save us and elevate us, but can only cause our universal destruction. Well, yeah, but also, see, these notions were outdated. That's the thing. I mean, the left is right in saying that traditionalism, traditional religion, traditional sexual morality, all that stuff is outdated, and that it's not rational, that it's not based on anything. Now, where they fail is they fail to understand that there were functions behind many of these things, that marriage had a function, right? And that sex roles have a function and so on, but But to understand those functions, to truly understand them as functions, not just as commandments from God, you have to understand evolutionary theory. And then you have to stare into this abyss that, oh, I'm just a reproducing machine. I'm not a child of God with some holy special soul that's going to go to heaven, and I'm here to do some important thing in God's big plan and all this other crap. It's hard for people to get through that, right? So what the left did is they created a new religion in which they retained a lot of the substructure of Christianity, but they replaced God with humanity. That's humanism, and there are two versions of it, the communist version and the liberal version. But they both kind of worship humanity and progress. And there's nothing wrong with that. Progress, again, the 20th century was a period of progress, right? So you're talking about the wars, but you're forgetting the enormous progress that happened during the 20th century. That people were lifted out of poverty. That before the 20th century, you might have, 6, 7 kids, and 5 of them would die. You would bury child after child from malaria or measles or smallpox or whatever, right? And you would go hungry, and you'd go out to work in the fields hungry, and you'd come home hungry, and you'd have no food for your family sometimes, like not so much in the Americas, but in the old world, hunger was still a real problem, even in Germany, even in the 20th century, or even in Japan, right? Even when it was industrializing, the Japanese were short because they didn't get enough food. And there's a great story that I heard about the Korean War. An American prisoner of war was, being subjected to the North Korean propaganda. And they were saying to him, in the communist utopia, you'll be able to have an egg every day. And the guy said, in America, you can just go to the store and buy as many eggs as you want. It's not a big deal, right? And they just thought he was lying. They couldn't imagine being able to go to the store and buy eggs. Just as many as you want. Like, you could eat 5 eggs a day if you want. There was enormous progress. So it's not surprising that people started to shift from, this worship of conservative traditions and imaginary gods and things to things like science and technology and humanity. It's not that surprising that people said, well, instead of believing in this crazy shit that doesn't deliver anything, let's switch over to believing in science and reason and medicine and all that stuff, and the market, because it's delivering the goods. Or the state, because the state is delivering the goods. The church is not delivering the goods. The state is doing it. Or the market is doing it. So it's not surprising people shifted over. All right, he said, so men become more effeminate, passive, liberal, atheistic. But there is a huge unforeseen problem in all of this. Men aren't the only ones making decisions here. Women are and have always been half the picture, and boy, oh boy, do they despise these modern males. The repulsion is quite physical. Having sex with them is emotional torture for women. For a man, the equivalent would be having sex with a literal pile of pig shit. It's tough out there, I get it, but it's not that tough. Do not exaggerate the extent of this. Anyway, all right, the guy said, so women begin doing the only thing they know how to in order to get men to act like men, shit testing. However, since the desire to dominate has been intellectually and emotionally beaten out of men, instead of manning up in the face of defiant, disrespectful women, they cower and comply, or put simply, they fail the shit test, and then the next, and then the next, until you have open matriarchy. I don't think we have an open matriarchy. What we have is guys like, Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and these other weirdos. We have a plutocracy. I don't know that we really have a matriarchy. We certainly have the dominance of women in education and, as these sort of moral harpies running around screaming at people and all that. Okay, then he said, by this time an entire generation of women has discarded their dutiful, simpy husbands en masse. This is when the divorce rates shoot up to 50%, now the next generation of men, half of whom are raised by divorced, neurotic, single mothers, not as boys, but as girls with penises. I mean, there's a slight element of truth to that. Yeah. Instinctively avoid getting married. Not only women are not interested in having children with such males, but the fact that a marriage is not in the picture does not bring the emotional stability a woman requires to feel safe enough to get pregnant in the first place. Hence, the birth rates drop. This story is not, it's a good story, but this is not really what happened. The birth rates plummeted basically right after the introduction of the birth control pill. You can see that in the data. Now, I don't know about Iran, but I know about Canada and the US. I mean, you could just see the huge plunge in the fertility rate right after the birth control pill. Okay, he said, there is no solution for any of this. If men start acting like men again, there is a guarantee that we will get trapped in face-saving games and dick-measuring contests that nearly destroyed Europe in 2 world wars, because masculinity by its nature and in all its real-world implementations is competitive, and this competition is always accumulative, meaning you have to one-up the previous guy to get noticed. This is already happening to some pickup artists who puff out their chests thinking it's good body language and getting their faces smashed in by youths of various diverse backgrounds in more manly neighborhoods. Yeah, that's true, actually. Right, so the whole pickup artist thing was bullshit. Like, first of all, these guys are probably just lying. Alright, I don't believe anything Roosh said. Okay, I mean, I don't know. I'm not saying he was lying for sure. I'm just saying I wouldn't believe some guy on the internet telling me he had sex with all these different girls. Now, if he's showing me pictures of all these different girlfriends, you know, kissing him or whatever, or videos of it, then I might say, okay. But if you're just writing about it, I'm going to say, I'm not going to believe it. And yeah, every guy kind of understands that if you go around with this very masculine, very aggressive and assertive body language, you can get your ass kicked. Men will instinctively recognize that as a challenge, and they'll try to bring you down a notch. Because yes, male competition is a real thing, just like women have a competitive game going on, men have a competitive game going on. So the solution is to just be a steady, kind of strong, silent guy, work on your body and your life, and also be open to talking to women and read their signals. That's the trickiest part for a lot of guys. Noticing what the women want you to do. Because, women are not that repulsed by men. They like guys, but men and women are on different wavelengths. And so often women will be communicating to you that I'm interested in you, but they're not going to just say, hey, I'm interested in you. They're going to smile at you. But, it's tricky because sometimes they smile at you and they're just being nice. Sometimes they smile at you and they're trying to say, hey, I like you. Now, they think you can read their mind, so that's a problem. So sometimes you just have to just guess, right? Just, okay, maybe she likes me, I'll try, right? You just have to try, and you're going to fail, but if you do it enough, you'll eventually succeed. Most likely. If you're a decent-looking guy, or just, even an average-looking guy, if he can just sort of, wear reasonable clothes, act in a reasonable manner, and not freak out when he's talking to a girl, but kind of hold his ground. It's really about holding your ground. It's about approaching, not in a super aggressive way, not like a pickup artist, but in a more reserved way, like, hey, I'm interested in you, but yeah, I'm not pretending to be something I'm not peacocking around like I'm the coolest guy in the world. There is a strategy that works, all right? Guys have figured this out. Even now, okay? I know this because my sons are out there. I was out there. I went through the whole thing, and now I see my sons going through it, and they're doing fine because they're decent-looking guys with the basic common sense. Anyway, so this guy was saying, puffing out your chest is an implicit challenge to other men. That's why women find it attractive. Once enough men on a given street puff out their chests, you realize what it actually means. So the right-wing solution to this problem, which often comes down to turning the clock back and sending women back to the kitchen and forcing men to act like men, through humiliation of deviant behavioral patterns doesn't work. There is a solution, it's just that nobody wants to do it because it doesn't appeal to them emotionally and intuitively. Because our emotions and intuitions aren't adapted to this environment. So when you tell people the solution, they reject it and instead they want to do something else. So that's why they'll do any stupid thing that doesn't work before they do what does work, because your intuitions in this environment are wrong. Alright, anyway, he said, here in Iran, the Islamic Republic has been trying to do it for a long time. It doesn't work because men don't want to die for no good reason, and in a resources-abundant world like ours, there is no good reason. But even if this solution did work, it would bring back the original problem. In America, for example, the intellectuals were not as convinced as their European counterparts. Sure, you had the devastating Civil War, but then, in the First and Second World Wars, you suffered minimal homeland destruction. For you, it took the defeat in Vietnam and the missile crisis to realize something was wrong. That thing is still there, you've just implemented dozens of hurdles on its way by emasculating men. Okay. And then James Connolly said, in response to that, he said, while I agree with much of what you're saying, I'm not sure your characterization of female sexuality is entirely accurate. Here in America, at least, there is a large subset of women who lust after K-pop pretty boys, extremely effeminate. Yeah, I mean, being a pretty boy has always, or being cute, has always been an option. A lot of that pickup artist stuff is just wrong, okay? It's not like you have to be the alphaist male in the world, okay? Now, K-pop stars are stars, and that's why women like them. They might not go for an effeminate guy on the street. But it's also about just, I don't know, it's about how you present yourself, okay? But you don't have to be alpha. You don't have to be the one guy in the entire world, the biggest guy, the strongest guy, the richest guy. It doesn't work like that. Okay, anyway, and he said, and fairly effeminate boy band, pretty boys like the Jonas Brothers. Even though these men are effeminate, I think the fact that they have extremely elevated status, not as much money as CEOs, but still far and away top 1%, and more importantly, fame, this and the fact that they have symmetrical faces and are at least not super short is enough. Well, I mean, yeah. Okay. Hypergamy is true, but women are also human and they have some common sense. And they do want men. It's not like they're repulsed by all men. Yes, it's tricky, it's difficult to navigate the modern sexual market. It has all the problems that I've talked about, that others have talked about. These things are all true. But do not use that as an excuse for apathy or to claim that the situation is hopeless, or that women will never want to go out with you or never want to have sex with you or whatever. That is not true. There are ways to succeed in this environment. You can do it. Do not give up.